Well, I hadn't really thought much about the topic of sex work until I met with a student of mine at Mount Holyoke College, where I was teaching journalism, to go over a class assignment she was writing. She was writing a profile about a young woman who was an activist in Northampton, Massachusetts, and had been responsible for helping to table or basically defeat an ordinance that would have made it illegal for the homeless people to panhandle in Northampton, it's a progressive town but increasingly gentrified. It's where Smith College is located. At any rate, she had come to me for help with trying to bring her subject to life on the page. She had heard this young woman speak at a town meeting and was very impressed by how she cared about people who were less fortunate than herself. But as we were talking about how she could make the profile more interesting, she suddenly blurted out, "She's a sex worker." And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Anyway, there were other interesting facets about her experience, and I was very curious because this young woman seemed to defy every stereotype I had about sex work. So I decided I was going to meet her, and she agreed to meet with me. And the story she told me really clashed with what the popular narrative of all sex workers being drug addicted, victimized women who are being abused by traffickers or pimps. And so I started looking into it. I was intrigued by this. As a journalist, I'm always looking for untold stories to tell, and this seemed very interesting. So she put me in touch with other sex workers around the country, and the more they told me, the more this clashed with the conventional wisdom. And I started doing research on the topic and found that there was some really interesting research out there that also clashed with the conventional wisdom, and in fact showed that laws that criminalize prostitution actually make it more difficult for sex workers and encourage violence against all women, not just sex workers, and encourage the exploitation of sex workers. And then I found that there was a growing body of research that showed that, again, laws that make it illegal make it harder for women and men who do sex work to access health care and practice safe sex. So, to prevent the spread of diseases like HIV, which leads to AIDS. And so I thought, this is interesting, and I decided to write a book about it. Not very well, I'm afraid. Sex workers, because there are so many laws that restrict prostitution, they are very marginalized. They can get arrested at the drop of a hat, and as I talk about in my book, the research shows that they can't often, find housing, because landlords don't want to rent to sex workers because they can be considered accomplices. And so if they find out that there's a woman who's doing sex work on the side or not even in her apartment, they might evict them, and that forces them into a cycle of homelessness and street walking. And as I talk about in my book, Getting Screwed, Sex Workers in the Law, it makes it street walking is much more dangerous for sex workers than it is for practicing sex work indoors. Street walkers are much more likely to get assaulted and abused, not only by clients, but also harassed by the police. And it makes it more difficult for them to negotiate safe sex. By that I mean sex with condoms. And it kind of leads to this cycle of violence and not having adequate access to health care. And this matters because there are some women, particularly street walkers, who get into sex work because they are feeding a drug addiction, and so they are turning to sex work to pay for the drug addiction. And when they are not able to negotiate safe sex, they're much more likely to be at risk of sexually transmitted diseases like HIV. So if sex work were legalized or decriminalized and regulated to some extent, and that has happened in a number of other countries, and that's where I draw my research from. Countries like the Netherlands, New Zealand, Germany, where it's been legalized to some degree. there are much lower rates of HIV spread in those countries. In fact, in New Zealand, condom use among sex workers has risen to over 99%. They're very careful to protect themselves. Similarly, if they get an abusive client or they feel that there's a violent predator on the loose, they are much more likely to go to the police because they're not going to get arrested as they are here in this country. So they work with the police to target abusive clients, and they also work with the police if they see incidents of true trafficking where someone is underage and is being trafficked. By federal definition, anybody under the age of 18 is considered a trafficking victim, even though such youth don't always see it that way themselves. But if adult sex work were legal in this country, sex workers would be much more comfortable going to the police to report both abusive clients and traffickers. Current laws very much hurt all women, because what happens is that sex workers are like canaries in the coal mine. They are often the first to see violent predators, and they're often the first to be victimized by violent predators. But these predators, and you've heard of serial killers like Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway out in Washington State. They started out by preying on sex workers because they figured they'd be less noticeable and they could get away with it. But they also hurt non-sex workers. So there's research done by John Jay College of Criminal Justice that shows that men who are violent towards sex workers are violent to other women as well, and it's a continuum. So again, it would decrease the rate of violence if sex work were decriminalized. And this has been shown in other research as well, which shows that countries like the US and Southeast Asia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which have the most restrictive laws against sex workers, have the most violence against women, while countries with the least restrictive laws, like the Netherlands and Germany, have the least amount of violence against sex workers. And in fact, sex workers in the Netherlands, another study found that they feel very safe, and because they don't have to worry about violence. Well, I think last year, Amnesty International came out and called for the decriminalization of sex work globally. And because of research, again, that's been shown in countries that have already done this, we need to decriminalize sex work, and then we can regulate it to some degree. And what happens in the Netherlands and in New Zealand is that the responsibility of regulating is up to the municipality or the state, and they can decide, okay, they don't obviously want a brothel or a massage parlor near a playground or a school. They don't want it at all. They don't have to have it. But if certain, larger urban areas want to, license a brothel or a massage parlor, they can decide where it's going to go, and then they do regular inspections. Not only then, this brothel is taxed like any other business. And then, of course, brings in revenues for states and municipalities, which is why, frankly, they've never been able to get rid of legal brothels in Nevada. Nevada is the only state in the nation that allows some forms of legal sex work in rural counties with populations of 400,000, because, first of all, it's very regulated, and it's a very safe environment I went out and visited one and talked to two actually, and talked to a number of sex workers there, and it's very safe for them and also for their clients. And again, these brothels are licensed and inspected regularly, and if they find that there are underage workers there, the brothel is shut down. Similarly, if they find, and this happens in other countries as well, if there are illegal immigrants, the brothel is shut down. So it's a way to regulate it. Similarly, I believe that we should also allow independent indoor workers to practice sex in small cooperatives where they have people looking out for their back, and they're looking out for each other. Right now, with criminal laws the way they are and the way they're abused in our society, is that police in many states arrest adult sex workers who are working by choice, and they charge them with trafficking each other, which is clearly not the case. They're working by choice. But they're misusing the laws against prostitution and against trafficking to arrest women who are out in the open practicing sex instead of going after the true traffickers who are operating in the shadows. So this is the problem with these kind of laws. Sex workers do not get a lot of empathy. There's a real moralistic, ingrained attitude that tends to marginalize sex workers, and I can go into that in a minute. But the reason why we should care is because it's a public health problem. I mean, when you have HIV being spread, and that costs the public a tremendous amount. People can come down with HIV, with AIDS, other sexually transmitted diseases. So you want to have a system where sex workers are encouraged to practice safe sex and where they feel safe to practice safe sex. So that's the health argument. And then there's the safety argument that, like I said before, that women who are not sex workers are also victimized by violent predators who have the sense of impunity because they've been killing or hurting sex workers, and then they start picking on non-sex workers as well. It's a human rights issue, and everybody in our society deserves to have a modicum of respect. They shouldn't have to be living outside the law. If they've been raped or robbed by a client or physically assaulted, they should be able to have the protection of the police, but they don't. They're a very much marginalized group. Let me go back to my other part of that answer before about why sex workers are so marginalized in our society, and it has to do with this centuries-old attitude. Our churches and our societies needed to differentiate two institutions that were extremely similar: marriage and prostitution. They both provided sex in exchange for something else. At least traditional marriages did, and sex work does as well. Sex work makes that bargain explicit with money and out down on the table. Marriage is more of an implicit understanding. So the people who were making the churches basically decided, well, we need to differentiate marriage, and they put marriage on a pedestal because, of course, that is the institution where you have children, and it's very important to encourage reproduction, otherwise you don't have a flourishing society. So marriage was put up on a pedestal, and prostitution was put down here, and prostitutes were vilified and called whores and sluts, and it really was a way to differentiate prostitution from marriage. And then you put on top of that the paternalistic system whereby women are not supposed to enjoy sex, women are not supposed to enjoy having multiple partners. I mean, the irony here is in this country there are almost as many male sex workers as there are female sex workers, but the men are not arrested and they're not harassed to the degree that the women are, and this gets into this idea that women are not supposed to have multiple partners, and they're certainly not supposed to be paid for sex. So that adds another layer to why sex workers are vilified in our country. I interviewed many sex workers, spent a lot of time with women, from streetwalkers, transgender streetwalkers who in Washington, D.C., all the way up to high-end escorts who charge $1,200 an hour for 2 hours with top government officials and corporate executives. And they're quite the range of women. The vast majority, and this is what studies show, the vast majority of people who get into sex work get into it by choice for economic reasons. They usually do it when they're, of age, usually 19, 20 on up, and they're doing it to pay off student loans, to get through college, to raise a family as a single parent. This is both men and women, and for economic reasons. And there was a study out of the Urban Justice Center of New York that found that 67% said they returned to sex work because they could not find another job that paid them a living wage. It's very expensive to live in cities like New York and many other cities, and this was a way that they could earn a living wage and also do something on the side. Like Jillian, the sex worker that first got me interested in this story. She is an activist and she loves to volunteer and help change society. She's involved in something called a Rise for Social Justice that works for prisoners. She's also involved with a mental health center, an alternative mental health center. She's trying to help people with mental illness. And so these are her passions, so she does sex work for 10 hours a week and she's able to earn a living and pay the rent, so she can do other things. Another man that I met at a conference, his name was, he was a gay male escort, his name was Legendary Dave, and he was a single father. You know, he was able to raise and live comfortably in Washington, D.C. and, you know, make good money as a sex worker. And he enjoyed what he did. Many sex workers consider it therapeutic, what they're doing. A lot of people come to them with things that they cannot do. Either they're very lonely, they don't have a relationship, their wife has died, their wife is sick, or they're not out of the closet, so they go to gay male escorts. So there's a real need out there, and sex workers are very discreet and they provide what's needed. So you also have drug-addicted streetwalkers, people who turn to sex work because, like I said, they need to feed a drug addiction. But instead of getting arrested, what they need is rehabilitation services. They need treatment. And, you know, I come from West Virginia, where we have a real drug epidemic. It started out with the opiate drugs, and now it's, you know, when they can no longer afford the opiate drugs, you know, like OxyContin as street drugs, they turn to heroin. And there's, you know, we have the highest rate of overdoses in the country in West Virginia, and there are women who are selling sex to pay for these drugs. But there are not enough rehabilitation services in West Virginia. You cannot get long-term treatment. So you get detoxed, you go back into the environment from which you came, and you're back on drugs within a day or a week. What they need is long-term rehabilitation. And that's where we should be spending our money, not in law enforcement to arrest sex workers. Our stereotype about sex workers are pretty women picking up men on the streets. That only, according to one study that I read, only 2% of all sex workers in this country work outdoors. Most sex work is done very quietly indoor. There is still street walking, but it's much less than it was 30 years ago. There's no question that there are people being trafficked into sex work in this country, much more overseas than in this country. But most of them are underage teenagers who have been neglected or abused in their own homes and have fled and are now selling sex for survival in an urban environment. And that includes LGBT youth who you know, were evicted from their homes and not made to feel welcome in their countries or their communities of origin. And so this is a problem, but what's interesting, it used to be called, traffickers used to be called pimps. Trafficking has become the new name for something that has been a problem for many decades, which is teenage runaways who are coerced into sex work. And right now, many of them are arrested, and then they're sent into foster care, where they're often re-abused and re-traumatized. And that's not where we should be putting our money. We should be putting our resources into providing social services for these young people to help them get off the street. Education, housing, counseling, and other services are what we need to do to help these youth. And we also need to spend more on preventative programs that attack the root cause of why young people get into sex work in the first place. So the problem with what's happening with the trafficking narrative is that anti-trafficking proponents have spread inaccurate and grossly inflated statistics on the number of women and children who are being trafficked in this country. You know, I interviewed the executive director of the Council Against Trafficking of Women, and she told me that 100,000 to 300,000 women and children are trafficked every year, and of course mainstream media breathlessly repeat that. The truth is that the number is far lower than that, and we don't know true estimates, but there are several studies that have been done. For instance, there was a study that the FBI did, and they found that in 1 year there were 100 juveniles who came to the attention of law enforcement who were doing sex work. Okay, so by definition, they're trafficking victims, simply because they're under 18. Now, that's not the true estimate. That's not the true number either, because that's only those who came to the attention of law enforcement. But 1,500 versus 100,000 it's a lot closer to the 1,500 number. But the problem is that it raises public alarm, and people are putting money into law enforcement when they should be putting money into helping these youngsters get off the street. Well, first of all, the other thing, I don't want to skip that question about the police, because bad laws lead to bad cops. And what happens when you have laws that criminalize sex work is that you have a minority police officers who are abusing the law and basically forcing sex workers to have sex with them rather than arrest them. And this happens in a lot of municipalities. Just recently, Oakland, California, they fired and are charging some of the police officers because they had sex with an underage prostitute. And they actually gave her information about impending raids that they were doing, so that she could warn the people who were being raided. I mean, there was, really corrupt stuff going on here. I mean, they should not have been having sex with an underage person to begin with, let alone an underage sex worker. But in Ohio, there was a study that found that police officers are the number one occupation in terms of going to sex workers. They even beat out politicians. The study found the police officers were even number one when they knew that the sex workers were being trafficked. So laws that criminalize sex work tends to corrupt police, and that's another reason why it should be legalized, so the police can really focus on solving violent crimes and going after the true predators and traffickers, rather than the sex workers themselves. Dallas has a very good program for trying to particularly help teenage runaways without arresting them. And in New York as well, Dallas, Texas, and New York as well, they passed something called the Safe Harbor Law, which means the police cannot arrest an underage sex worker. Instead, they're supposed to help them with social services. So, and they've been trying to get this Safe Harbor Law passed in other states as well, with less success. So, and I would say that California, San Francisco, because that was the origin of the modern sex workers movement, has always had a very strong community of activist sex workers. So the police there are very careful, and they don't arrest underage sex workers, and they also, don't harass unnecessarily sex workers. And then, of course, you go over to Oakland, which is in Alameda County, and they do harass and arrest sex workers. It's just right across the bay. And of course, this is what happens. They get police officers who have done some very corrupt things. In countries like New Zealand, which I think has the best model, because they decriminalize sex work, and then they regulate it to some degree. So it's not that they, for instance, the difference between New Zealand and Germany and the Netherlands is it's completely legalized in those countries, but sex workers have to register. And the problem with that is they don't want to acknowledge what they're doing publicly, because that puts a big scarlet A on them. And so many of them don't register. So you have a large population of illegal sex workers, particularly in Germany. While in New Zealand, sex workers don't have to register, but they still pay taxes, and they often, basically pay taxes by saying that they're independent consultants or whatever. They use some sort of rubric for it. And when a business, they don't regulate the sex workers, they regulate the businesses. So it's the brothels, the massage parlors, the spas that are regulated and licensed and inspected regularly, not the individual sex workers. And I think that's just a smarter way to do it, because As a result, like I said, you have sex workers who negotiate safe sex a lot more. Like I said, more than 99% of sex workers in New Zealand use condoms, and it's just a much safer and health-conscious approach. In fact, New Zealand has among the lowest HIV rates in the world. So I think that we could move toward a New Zealand model where the businesses that facilitate prostitution are the ones that are regulated, as opposed to the individuals who actually practice the sex work. I think New Zealand is what sex workers, what policymakers who have studied this, what researchers who have studied this say, is that they all point to New Zealand as being the smartest and most effective approach to decriminalizing sex work and regulating it to some degree. It also gives sex workers greater agency. I mean, one of the things that many sex workers don't like about the legal brothels in Nevada is that they have to share half of their earnings with the brothel owners. So, and it's a very corporate, male-dominated structure. Most of the brothels in Nevada are owned by men, whereas in New Zealand, many sex workers work together in small cooperatives, and it's, where it's much more equal, and they don't have to share their earnings with a higher corporate entity. And I just think that that way you just have less likely that sex workers would be working outside the law that way. Well, it has to be done. This is a political issue, and that's what makes it so difficult, because politicians, for moralistic reasons, because they want to be perceived as tough on crime, politicians haven't exactly stepped up to the plate on this issue. It has to be done on a state-by-state basis, because the laws that govern sex work in this country are done on a state-by-state basis. Every state has slightly different laws as to what is illegal, what is not. In some states, oral sex is not, paid oral sex is not illegal, and you have to have penetration. In other states, anything, including fondling, is illegal. So I think that the change has to come on a state-by-state basis, similar to legalizing marijuana. There's a very similar analogy. Just as with legalizing marijuana, if you decriminalize sex work, you will get rid of the criminal underbelly of the trade, and it has to be done on a state-by-state level. So you're starting to see marijuana legalized for either medical use or recreational use on a state-by-state level, and more states are coming on board. So if they could get this passed in one state and see how it works out, then you probably have other states follow suit. Because there's a tremendous advantage, not only for public health and safety, but it would add significant tax revenues to financially strained governments. Well, that's about Coyote. That was in the 1960s, a woman by the name of Margot St James, who was a party girl. She was a beatnik living in San Francisco, and she wasn't a sex worker, but she was arrested, and they charged her with doing sex work, and she was so ticked off by that, and she was, she said to the judge, I've never turned a trick in my life. And the judge said, well, if you know that language, then you must be a sex worker. And he convicted her. Anyway, she went to law school so she could get that conviction overturned, and she did. And she spent the rest of her life, she basically, started working with, this was during the feminist revolution, and, in the late 60s, early 70s, and of course, and she started this movement called Coyote, which stands for Call Off Your Tired Old Ethics. And that was the beginning of the modern sex workers' rights movement. And it spread to other states, but there's been a lot of steps backward, primarily because of the anti-trafficking movement has really spread a lot of misinformation about sex work, and it's very morally driven by conservatives and by church groups. Well, that gets back to what I talked about before, is that because of the internet, Most sex workers advertise on the internet, they advertise on websites, and they screen clients through the internet, and they find out who they are and where they work, and they decide if they want to meet with that client. And so they can do that indoors. And in fact, the internet has led to a rapid decrease in the use of pimps. Because they don't need pimps anymore to find customers. It's also led to that percentage I talked about, that only 2% of sex workers in this country now walk the streets. Most of them work indoors. And the internet has allowed this to happen. But unfortunately, because of anti-trafficking laws and this big push, the state governments, state law enforcement have been closing down some of these websites that allow sex workers to advertise in safe and healthier ways than they could if they were walking on the street. And they closed down Rent Boy, which was a gay male escort site, and there's no hint of any trafficking going on Rent Boy and some of these other sites. And in fact, they more recently closed down what is called the Review Board, which was a website for sex workers in Seattle. And I did a blog about this and interviewed the police chief up there, who said, "Oh, well, the Review Board was an anti-list of the underworld sex trafficking trade, and they were bringing in all these, slave labor and all this kind of stuff." And there's just one hitch: it's not true. None of the women who advertised on the Review Board were being trafficked. They were advertising of their own volition, and then they also, as part of this, raided some apartments where women were allegedly selling sex. And again, those women were there of their own volition, and none of them had been trafficked. And if you look at the prosecutor's charges, there's no charges involving trafficking, because he knows it's all about facilitating prostitution or soliciting. But what they're doing when they close down these websites, it just makes it more dangerous for sex workers. They closed down Craigslist, adult site. But what they do is they speak in code. They're still on Craigslist, but in the therapy section or in the casual section, and they say something like, "I love 200 roses." And that means I want $200. And so they come up with ways to get around the fact that the adult section of Craigslist was closed down. Well, that's absolutely right. So it's like a game of whack-a-mole. They spend all this money, law enforcement, to close down one website. Another one's just going to pop up because the demand is there. And so sex workers will supply the demand. Right now, Nevada is the only, as I said, it's the only state in the nation that allows sex work. But did you know that for 30 years, indoor sex work was legal in Rhode Island because of a loophole in the law? So from, I think it was 1980 to 2009, I don't remember, anyway, it was for 30 years, there was some crazy loophole in the law that only made outdoor sex work illegal. And during that time period, in the state of Rhode Island, the rate of rapes and gonorrhea saw steep declines. So I think that's kind of telling. And then in 2009, there was a big brouhaha from anti-trafficking proponents, and the legislature closed the loophole. And that put a lot of indoor sex workers out onto the street, which is where it's just so much more dangerous, both for public health and safety. So sex work, both indoors and outdoors, is now illegal in Rhode Island. The irony about Sin City is that sex work is illegal in Las Vegas and Reno. You have to go out to some of these rural counties like Pahrump and others, and that are at least 45 minutes to an hour outside of Las Vegas to get to see a sex worker. But it's kind of, I find it ironic, because if you've ever been to Las Vegas, you see half-nude women parading around. If you want to have your picture taken, you see people handing out all kinds of things for sex work, erotic dancing and such. And the casinos pretty much turn a blind eye of elegant white hookers pick up men at the casino bars. But the police continue to harass minority sex workers and minority streetwalkers. In fact, when I was in Las Vegas, I was having dinner at this Bavarian restaurant, and I happened to sit at the same table with two very well-dressed African-American young women. And they had been coming out of a nightclub. They were there to have fun. They were sisters, and it was one of their birthdays, and they're both professionals, and they met in Las Vegas because one's from California, the other one is from the East Coast. And they were coming out of a nightclub and hailed a taxi, and they were arrested for prostitution. They were stopped for prostitution, simply because of, the fact that they were black. Now, they didn't get hauled off to jail, fortunately, but I mean, that just goes to show the sense of the way things, law enforcement is inequitably pursued when it comes to sex work in Las Vegas, and which is kind of ridiculous because everybody thinks that if they go to Sin City that they can get laid. Well, that's not the case. Well, I talked about, legal and illegal versions of how they treat sex work in a number of countries. The reason why I want to talk about Sweden is because they were the first to implement what's called the Nordic Model, where they criminalize buyers, not the selling of sex, but the purchase of sex. In other words, an attempt to go after clients. And they did this out of some well-intentioned idea of treating sex workers as victims. They shouldn't, we shouldn't be arresting them, we should be arresting the clients. The problem is that just makes sex work more dangerous for sex workers, and that's what has happened in Sweden. They changed the law in 1999 to make the purchase of sex illegal, and since then sex workers have actually been more harassed by police, more likely to get evicted, and more likely to get victimized by both police and also by abusive clients, because clients are so afraid of being arrested that they rush the transaction, and that makes it harder for sex workers to negotiate safe sex and to also screen clients and to see if they're safe or not. So they just kind of have to hop into the car, and that's just not really a very safe venue for doing business. In addition, many of the clients that are left are drunk and violent, so it's actually become more dangerous for sex workers on the street. So Sweden has actually made it more dangerous for people to do sex work, not safer, and they still get harassed by police and threatened and hunted as well. And many police tell landlords, and they get evicted. So it's actually not worked out, and yet they're trying to bring the Nordic model to other anti-prostitution proponents have been trying to bring it to Canada and to the U.S. and because they want to end end demand. But prostitution is as we always say, is one of the oldest professions in the book, and you're not going to be able to eliminate it. Despite all the laws you throw at it, commercial sex continues to thrive here and globally. So why not make it safer for the men and women who practice it? And why not, this way, allow law enforcement to focus on real crimes and pursue people who really are trafficking underage kids. Because of a lawsuit against the fact, because there's a lot of really good research out of Canada that showed that the laws there made it very dangerous for sex workers and impaired their health and safety, all of what I've been talking about up till now. And so they filed a lawsuit, and a professor in Toronto took it on, kind of pro bono, and argued it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in December 2014, the Canadian Supreme Court overthrew all the laws against prostitution in Canada. The problem was that at that particular time, a conservative government was in power. So instead of seeing that, that the reason why the Canadian Supreme Court overturned these laws is because they threatened someone's right to security, to safety and health, which is written in the Canadian Charter. And instead of understanding that that's why the laws were overturned, they then just turned around and passed new laws including the, criminalizing the buying of sex, the advertising of sex, and a bunch of other things, which will also get overturned, but it'll take another 10 years to wend through the courts to get overturned. So it's just an awful waste of everybody's money, and in the meantime, sex workers are no safer than they were before. Well, I think the Silent No More refers to, I went to a conference in Las Vegas called, it's the Desiree Alliance, and it's basically a conference by and for sex workers. And it was an amazing confab of all kinds of different women and men. It's where I met Legendary Dave and some other interesting sex workers. They had sessions from the human rights violations that they always encounter, the problem with how trafficking has confused and conflated the issue, all the way to sessions that teach them how to practice safe sex and how to improve their business and how to get paid and how to get a deposit through one Legendary Dave has them send him a deposit through FedEx. And there's a way you can get a cash card through Amazon, and all these methods for trying to evade legal detection. So this was a fascinating conference that I attended. But what struck me most about this was that these women were, unlike previous generations of sex workers that were very marginalized and very intimidated and very much in the shadows, these women had come together, hundreds of them, and they were silent no more. I mean, they were really speaking up for their rights and talking about ways in which to try to change legislation and try to improve their lives. And I thought that was really interesting, and that's what I end my book with. The one other thing that maybe we could add in is that sex workers are really interesting, bright, human beings, and they go into sex work for a variety of reasons, most of which are economic. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we could pay young women a living wage, even college graduates? But in today's economy, particularly if you major in things that are not science or engineering, or you don't have a skill set, it's very hard for them when they're coming out of college today, the millennials, to earn a living wage. And young men are more likely to be able to earn a living wage simply because more of them are majoring in science and engineering, which pay well, or computer science. So what we need to do as a society is improve the living wage for both, college graduates and non-college graduates, so people don't feel the need to go into sex work for economic reasons. On the other hand, we have to respect the fact that this is their choice. Similarly, as one sex worker said to me, it's my body, and it's my choice what I want to do with it. So, we need to respect the fact that they're making a choice with what they're going to do with their body, and as long as they're not hurting anybody, I see no reason why they shouldn't be allowed to do sex work to earn a living wage. And I find the laws in this country incredibly hypocritical. If you look at somebody like Donald Sterling, the former owner of the Yankee Clippers, well, he spent millions of dollars on a young woman who's his mistress. He bought her a car, bought her an apartment, kept her in the style to which she wanted to be accustomed. And I don't, and yet police don't arrest Donald Sterling for doing that. That's legal. But what is not legal is when you want to have an hour or two or an overnight experience with a young woman or man, and you give them money. That's illegal. Well, I don't see any difference between the two, and I don't see why we're penalizing one and not the other.